It's individuals taking advantage of negative stereotypes in this case, but to take advantage of those to make money off of them.
Welcome to Selfhood, a podcast that asks the question, Who am I? We believe the quest of all quests is the quest to find oneself and engage scholars and experts in various fields to build a rich, layered picture of this journey. I'm your host, Pooja Mutharaj, and I'm trying to figure out who I am. I'm joined today in this quest by Dr. Matthew Oware, a professor at the University of Richmond, whose research centers around constructions of racialized and gendered identities in popular culture, Black masculinity in African American expressive culture, and the Black family in American society. A lot of this, particularly through the lens of rap music. So much to talk about there, and a lot of really interesting intersectional and contemporary lenses on selfhood. Dr. Ore, it's a pleasure to have you on. Um,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, of course. Before we get into your research, I wanted to start off with a little bit about yourself, if you wanted to share. Um,
Sure.
would you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came across this field of study?
Sure. So I guess I'll take you back to when I was younger. Okay, so when I was younger, I listened to rap music, but as I've told other folks, my dad would say, "Turn off that trash," right? Like it was. So this was so that word "trash" was actually used before the trash. It's been around for a while.
Yeah.
My dad would say like turn off that trash, that's horrible music. So like I wouldn't play it in the day, but I would like get up at like at midnight and turn on the radio and like put my ear next to the speaker, and like I wouldn't play the music loudly at all, but like I was so drawn to the music. It was so like invigorating and exciting, and the beats were so compelling and the lyrics were so like astonishing that I thought, man, this medium is something that like connected with me, right? And so I listened to rap music when I was young. I listened to it when I was in high school. I continued listening to it when I was in college. I listened to it for all of my life. It was only when I got to postgraduate school, so like my first couple of years at my new job, that I thought, this is a form of music. It seems to be talking a lot about different things, right? And they're talking about things that we generally talk about in sociology. I should say my background is in sociology, specifically, and my area of research is race and ethnicity, gender, masculinities, as you mentioned, popular culture, looking at these things through popular culture. And I thought rap music has a lot to say about these things. I think there's a scholarly realm here that I can tap into. And so I started looking at some of these themes, how artists talk about or articulate some of these themes in their music when I was in when I fresh out of graduate school. But sort of before I sort of dive into that, I do want to talk about my dissertation work. So as I said, my area of interest is race and ethnicity, and
Yeah.
this was really sort of honed in for me when I was in graduate school. It was percolating when I was in undergrad, but when I got to graduate school is when it really sort of hit me. Oh, this is what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in issues of identity, racial identity. Specifically, my dissertation was on the factors that influence mixed race individuals, individuals who have parents of different ancestral backgrounds, to choose a particular identity, right? Whether that was a monoracial identity, a multiracial identity, the type of multiracial identity it was, and what sort of led them to make that choice. So my dissertation, I actually used a quantitative data set out of the University of North Carolina called Adolescent Health.
Mhm.
And what was the great thing about this data set is that it asked the question of adolescents at home, tell us what your tell us what your racial identity is. It also asked that same question of adolescents when they were at school, tell us what your racial identity is. And so the fascinating thing that came out of this is that mixed race individuals, or individuals who have parents of different racial backgrounds, there was like variation in the selection of their identity at home versus at school. There was a large percentage of variation of racial identity at home versus at school. Now, while this was exciting at the time, this was a while ago, while this was exciting at the time is because individuals understood racial identity as something that was static. That is, if
Yeah.
you had a racial identity at birth, it was that same racial identity at death, right? And so what was fascinating about these particular findings were that we see fluctuation between in racial identity across environments, across time, across space, right? And so what I wanted to look at was one, what was this fluctuation? And two, why was this fluctuation happening? So some of the things that I found was mixed race adolescents at home, they would identify the way their parents told them to identify, right? So if a parent said, you are this race or this identity, that's what the adolescent said, right? And at home, I'm sorry, at school, there was a little more latitude. So adolescents tended to identify based on their peer group. So if they had a peer group that was predominantly of one race, they identified as that one race, or they identify themselves based on their romantic partner or other sorts of relationships, right? So it's this interesting dynamic that showed, and this is a sociological principle or sociological idea, that external factors, in this particular case, external factors being family, parents, peers, neighborhood, actually influences a person's racial identity, right? And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily this thing that's rooted in biology, that's static, that's inherent, that's innate. Rather, it fluctuates across time, space, context, etc., right? And so this was a really sort of compelling finding from my dissertation research. And once I got interested in sort of using or looking at rap from a more scholarly and academic approach, I wanted to bring that sort of analysis to rap music. So one of the questions that I ended up asking was, well, how do rap artists articulate themes of identity in their music,
Mm.
right? What are some of the things that they're saying about their racial identity in their music? Another question that arose was, how do rap artists talk about I looked at predominantly men. I have a book and I look at men, women, but like prior to my book, my research was primarily on male artists. I do have an article on female artists,
Mm.
but for the male artists, I looked at, well, how do they talk about these notions of masculinity, right? Another interest of mine was sort of expressions of masculinities, plural, right? Understanding how, like, there are these ideas of supposed toxic masculinity, of healthy masculinity, right? So I wanted to explore, how do rap artists, male rap artists, talk about notions of masculinity in their music, understanding that the genre is sort of constructed as this hyper-masculine space, right? So what's the sort of performativity that's taking place amongst artists, right? And so I saw the spectrum, right? And so there were some artists who engaged in sort of hyper masculinity. But at the time, he's sort of shamed now, and rightfully so. But Kanye West was talking about masculinity in more nuanced ways than some prior artists or artists prior to him, right? And so there was a song where he talked about my friends are my family. There was
Mm.
a song where he talked about, right, you don't have this may be construed as homophobic, but he said you don't have to be gay to love your man, right? You don't have to be gay to love your homie, right? Like, there may be some who construe that in sort of a homophobic way, but from Kanye, but I think there's a deeper point there, right? He's talking about expressions of love, of vulnerability, right? And so I noticed that he and some other artists were sort of bucking this notion of hypermasculinity in their music, right? And they were also talking about sort of their racial identity in particular ways. And so I wanted to look at that. Another question that I looked at was, how do female artists talk about notions of feminism, sort of Black feminist thought, right? Or feminism in general, right? And so I looked at female artists and explored like constructions of feminism in their music. What was interesting was there was a lot of literature that said that Black female rappers don't actually call themselves feminists. But if you look in their music, it is predominantly, it is mainly feminist themes, right? And so so one of the questions was, what's the disconnect between actually calling oneself feminist as opposed to expressing themes of feminism? And that's something that I tried to unpack, right? So the point, and also how artists talk about class, that was another theme that I was interested in, like sort of notions of growing up in poverty and how that impacts one's way of sort of thinking about the world. And then the intersection of those three things, right? And so for me, rap music was like this great medium that students were listening to, so I could have these conversations with students about rap artists, about their music, and then bring in these themes that sociologists talk about all the time. So, for example, I realized like early on that I couldn't just like have students do a reading on feminism and then say, "Hey, let's talk about feminism." What I found is that students like sat on their hands. But
Mm.
if I brought in a song by a rap artist, for example, Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion had a song called WAP, right? So like everyone knew WAP,
Right.
right? Everyone knew that song, right? So like I would play that song and then we would talk about it. And then I would bring in these notions of, well, is this a feminist song? The way we understand feminism, well, based on the readings that we've done, right? And so then that way I can get them to sort of to meet them where they are, right? And we could say the same thing about do the same thing with race, like doing readings on race and ethnicity, or doing readings on masculinities, or doing readings on gender. Like this genre allowed me to have these more in-depth, deeper level conversations. And so from that, I've sort of been writing in these different areas over the last sort of over the last decade, right? In different ways that I think is really productive, not only for, so again, meeting students who listen to rap music, meeting them where they are, but also like sort of this broader understanding of how this genre could help us understand other dynamics that are happening in our society. So that's a long-winded answer to a
Perfectly
question I
worded.
don't even
Yeah.
remember you asking. I think you were
Yeah.
saying talk about your journey. So that's kind of that was essentially my journey.
No, that's great. And I feel like you've touched on a lot of the questions that I was sort of curious about with regard to your research too.
Sure. And
Um,
we can unpack those more.
yeah, yeah, with regard to just, why rap was such a powerful medium and talking about how it is really a way to connect with students as well. But I mean, even within that, do you think that there's something about rap specifically that makes it for the artist a very powerful way to convey these notions and explore these notions of who they are?
I think so. I think for those artists who do engage in it, and I don't want to dismiss the commercial element of it. There is a commercialized element of it where I think you will have artists saying things because essentially they realize that they can make money, right?
Mhm.
So there's been a lot of literature that talked about how record labels would seek out certain types of artists or seek or tell artists that they want them to say particular things
Yeah.
because those things would sell, right? But sort of beyond that, I do think that you'll find, I think, to the artist that they feel like there's something compelling in the music that allows them to express some aspect of themselves, whether that's their identity, some form of identity, or some other aspect of themselves, right? I think there's some authenticity there, there's some genuineness there that we see amongst various artists. I definitely think that that's a medium that some individuals feel like they can use to convey how they feel to the world. But I also think that's the same with country music. I think that's the same with classical music. I think that's the same with rhythm and blues, right? Or jazz, right? There are these mediums where individuals feel like they're connected to it and they can express whatever they're feeling on the inside to the rest of the world.
Yeah, yeah. And especially talking about it as a very accessible medium, I think
Right.
is really important, especially sort of in the contemporary sense of like how do we explore our identities today as they're
That's
changing.
right.
Um, I was very curious when you were talking about your dissertation earlier and how, different groups identify themselves differently in schools versus at home. How do these sort of play out in the sense of, is there a broader idea of the self that they hold, or like a majority identity that they hold in that sense? Or, which groups or identifications pull you more? Let's say like a significant other, um, in your relationship with your significant other, you identify as X, but in your relationship with your peer group, you identify as Y. How did those forces kind of play out and tug you in one direction or another?
Yeah. Um, I should say that you're freezing, you froze a little there. So I think I got the general crux of your question though. So because I used a data set, I wasn't able actually to sit down and interview
Mhm.
actual individuals, right? So you're sort of asking these sort of more nuanced questions that I think are definitely answerable if I were to sit down with those individuals and talk to them through their process of racial identity, racial identification. But because I didn't have that or I wasn't able to do that, I'm sort of forced to rely on the literature,
Yeah.
right? And so what the literature ultimately says is that it's not necessarily that there is one that pulls more than the other or one that has more weight than the other. It just, so for example, there's a researcher who looked at mixed race individuals in college and found that this was mixed race black and white individuals and found that when those mixed race black white individuals were around black people, they tended to accentuate or
Mm.
really prop up their blackness. But when they were around white individuals, they sort of pitched themselves or positioned themselves based on this notion of whiteness, right? So like they may have changed their inflection in their voices, or they may have changed their dress, right? And so it's really sort of contextual. It really sort of depends, right? And then at home, again, it's how mom or dad or mom and dad or other caregivers might see you and interact with you. And so you sort of position yourself based on how others view you. And so that's actually a larger sociological notion called the generalized other, right? And so what that essentially means is our identities are informed or partially informed by how we think others view us.
Yeah.
That is to say, right? Like, so I think this example works well for students, right? Like, so I tell my students in my class, right? Like, so you're sitting in my class and you're presenting yourself in a particular way. And so I ask them, like, so how are you presenting yourself? And so someone will essentially get to the word studious, right? Or like, right? And so that's your particular identity in that moment in class, right? You're presenting yourself as studious. And for you, studious means raising your hand, answering questions when the professor asks a question, nodding your head when the professor speaks, right? So there's this notion of Irving Goffman, sociology, who says that we all engage in presentation of self. And
Mhm.
specifically what that means is we want to present the most favorable image to others so that they have like a positive impression of us. But that's this interaction, implicit or explicit interaction between us and other individuals in our environments, whether we sort of believe it or not, right? And so the generalized other is this belief that there are certain behaviors that we should exhibit, right? And other behaviors that we aren't necessarily supposed to exhibit, right? So generally speaking, people are supposed to present themselves as, for lack of a better word, nice, like not mean, right? Not overly angry or violent, right? Because the general notion in our society is that people are sort of affable, not angry, right? And so that notion actually impacts how we behave, right?
Yeah.
And it also could potentially embed itself within us. That is to say, as I move through the world, I want to present myself in particular ways so that I'm presented favorably, right? Um, again, the obvious example is students and how they're interacting in class. Another more racialized example is, say, if African American or a Black person who's had sort of negative experience with the police is pulled over. There's a particular presentation that that person thinks that they want to have.
Yeah.
Hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock. A lot of yes sirs, no sirs, right? So again, sort of yes sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, right? A lot of sort of interacting based on how we think others might perceive us, right? And so again, I'm sort of that notion of the generalized other, that notion of interacting with members of our society, we see that articulated in with multiracial, mixed racial individuals, right? They are attempting in some cases to present themselves to particular racial groups in particular ways.
Hmm.
Now, how that maps onto rap music is a rap artist might say, I want to have this image of myself, but there's this sort of this hypothetical listener, this hypothetical consumer.
Yeah.
So based on what I might believe that hypothetical consumer or that hypothetical listener might want to hear, I might say some things along those lines,
Hmm.
right? But at the same time, I do think, again, that there are some artists that are being genuine and authentic in some of the things that they're saying. But at the same time, I think there might be some performativity there, right? For a sort of invisible audience or an invisible consumer. But
Hmm.
it's still like fascinating to see like how one positions themselves based on these sort of broader factors.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially as you're talking about this idea of wanting to project yourself as nice or not as violent, even
That's right.
in general life. But then you see a lot of those themes actually show up in rap music.
That's right.
So why,
How do you explain that disconnect?
yeah.
Because this is a racialized element.
Hmm.
So one of the reasons that rap music is sells so high, it's one of sort of the highest selling genres, is essentially it's this notion of a rebellious youth, right? So for one to be rebellious, they have to send signals of their rebellion, right? And part of that, for at least males, is being hypermasculine, right? I'm a badass, right? And let me explain to you how that actually manifests
Right.
itself, right? That might manifest itself me being bad. That might manifest in me like brandishing a weapon and using that weapon or fighting or beating you up or not or bullying, right? Like so this genre is constructed and has been constructed in a particular way that's racialized because Black Americans historically have been racialized as violent individuals, right? And so that creeps into the music itself. And so, what researchers have found is some of the largest consumers of rap music have been white youth, specifically white youth who haven't had interactions with Black people. So, they're
Wow.
only sort of working on these perceptions that they have. And
Yeah.
one of those perceptions is, in this particular case, the angry Black man,
Mm.
right? And so that notion actually is titillating, it's exciting, right? So you have an instance where a white listener can interact with the music, can listen to the music, but not actually sort of live the life or live some of the things that this artist is saying, right? So they can like listen to it vicariously, right? And so that's the exciting part of the music, but that music is just sort of really wrapped up in this notion of rebellion, right? And rebellion itself sells, right?
Yeah, that is really. Do you think that the rapper, as they're writing these lyrics, as they're
Yeah.
performing,
Yeah.
they're sort of subconsciously aware of that audience of sort of like the white youth who has had no interaction with the Black community, let's say?
So I don't know if they're necessarily focusing on the a white youth. I think what they're focusing on is rebellion sales,
Mm-hmm.
right? Me as a rapper saying that I have sexual relations with a lot of women, sales. Me saying that I have a lot of money, sales,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
like me saying that I'm violent and I'll beat you up, that's sales, right? So I
Yeah.
don't think they have like a demographic in mind, but I think they have like this theme
Hmm.
will sell. And they know that because previous artists have said the same things and it has sold,
Yeah.
right? So I'm going to sort of take you back a bit. So there was a rap group called NWA.
Mhm.
Have you ever heard of NWA?
I haven't.
Oh, okay. So they came out in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and they were particularly graphic group. They said a lot of graphic things, right? And so what ended up happening was there were organizations that protested their music, right? So you had mothers organizations, other types of organizations that protested their music because these organizations said that they were graphic and that they were harmful to kids. And so what ended up happening was there would be these sort of parental advisory stickers that were placed on these particularly graphic rap albums. Now, what ended up happening was those albums would actually sell more
Mm,
if they had the parental advisory sticker on them
mhm.
because it was in some way a marker of like
Sig-
badassery, if you will, right? And so teens were attracted to, and they had the sticker that said, "Oh, graphic lyrics on this, right? You have to be of a certain age to purchase it." That actually increased the artist's record sales. And so other burgeoning artists, right, saw this and said, "Oh, wait a minute. If I could say some of the same things that that group is selling, then my music will sell as well." And so what ended up happening was a bunch of copycat organist or rap groups, right, saying similar things to NWA, right? And so you fast forward like 20 something years later, and there's an artist named 50 Cent. Have you ever heard of 50 Cent?
Yeah. Very.
And prior to 50 Cent, there's an artist named Tupac. Have you ever heard of Tupac? Okay. So one of the interesting things is so like Tupac gets shot. He gets shot 5 times. He talks about being shot 5 times. Tupac's catalog, his records continue to grow because he's seen as this mythical figure who's overcome death because he's gotten shot 5 times and he's still alive. 5, 10 years later, 50 Cent comes around and 50 Cent says, "I got shot 9 times." Right? And these things, I think these things were true, but nevertheless, the point is I'm articulating these things in my music to show that I'm this sort of this bigger than life figure. And
Mhm.
50 Cent's album sales skyrocket. Again, the notion of the rebel
Mhm.
sells,
Mhm.
right? And the rebel could be of a particular racial background. In this particular case, the rebel is black, a black male rebel, right? And then you map that onto stereotypes that are already out there about black men. And really, in some ways, it's individuals taking advantage of negative stereotypes in this case, but to take advantage of those to make money off of them,
Mhm.
right? So in some ways, it's strategic, right? And it's so strategic that unfortunately, now there are some individuals, for example, police officers, judges, who think that the lyrics that the artists are saying in their music should be taken literally,
Mhm.
right? So when they say I shot someone, or when they say I sold this drug,
Mhm.
like there are authority figures that they believe, like, oh, we should take this literally. They literally did this.
Yeah.
But in many cases, this is not them sort of they haven't done these things. They're only saying these things to essentially sell records.
Yeah. It's interesting how there's kind of like a construction of the rap self then, right?
Right.
So there's the actual rapper and their self, and then
That's
the
right.
rap identity or the rap persona is totally different from that.
That's right. That's
So
right.
it's almost, I mean, especially going with this idea of rebellion,
That's right.
it's an exploration of what you're not more so than what you are.
That's right.
And
And
that
it's this idea that I can make money,
mm-hmm.
right? I can monetize this rebelliousness. I can monetize this negative attribute
Mm,
that has been imposed upon a population since its, arrival to the United States, right? So Black people have always sort of been presented as these threatening figures, right? And so again, in many ways, it's strategic. It's using the stereotype against itself, right? Well, yes, if I'm threatening and dangerous, let me attempt to make money off of that.
Hmm.
Because there are kids who will purchase that rebellion, that notion of me being threatening, right? Of me being a supposed drug dealer, of me being a supposed gangbanger, right? I tell this story when I arrived to college during my first week of school. I was on a floor with predominantly white males. I went to a large University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign,
Hmm.
large institution. And so again, when I arrived that first week in the dorms, there was a white guy across from me. And you're getting to learn people on your floor.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so his first question to me was, "Where are you from?" And I told him Chicago. His second question to me was, "Are you in the gang?" Yes, yes. And I said no. And like I often reflect that I should have said yes and then robbed him.
Oh my gosh.
But I said no, and but there's this perception, right? There's this perception that's had, right?
Yeah.
And so like the my joke, right? I mean it as a joke, but like for some of these rappers,
Right.
that's exactly right. They're not robbing, right? But they're like playing into the stereotype and attempting to monetize it, right? Because
Yeah.
if that perception is already out there, then why not monetize it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I have really complicated feelings about that because on one hand you're kind of like playing into the stereotype and
That's right.
perpetuating it,
That's right.
right? But at the
That-
same time it's like if you're going to be associated with this label anyway,
That's right.
maybe the best thing that you can do is just take whatever advantage you can get out of it.
That's right. Especially if you find yourself in a situation where you might actually need the money, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So like your question is a really good one, right? Like this sort of complicated relationship, right? Because you're right, you might perpetuate it, but
Hmm.
then someone might say, well, even if you don't perpetuate it, that perception still is out there,
Hmm.
right? And so someone might characterize you as the exception.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you're not a gangbanger, you're not a drug dealer. Okay, you're the exception. Because
Right.
we know that you're not hyper violent, you're the exception. Because we know that those people are still that way, right?
Mhm.
And so like the perception is still out there. And if I'm a person who finds myself in dire straits, that is from a poverty-stricken background, etc., and this is my route, then it might be strategically advisable to, in fact, play upon this stereotype so that I can make money, right?
Mhm.
By the way, that same dynamic applies to, or can apply to, female rappers who sort of sexualize themselves, right? The notion is, yeah, some female rappers might say, I don't want to sexualize myself in my music. I want to sort of strictly be looked at for my verbal acumen, right? My rap skills, my wordplay, right? But then there's also the argument that we live in a patriarchal society,
Mhm.
right? We live in a misogynist and sexist society. So whether you opt out of that particular expression or not, you will still be part of the male gaze, right?
Mhm.
And if this is an outlet or a genre where you want to make music, I've seen this sort of articulated by some artists, right? It doesn't matter if you sexualize yourself or not, you're going to be sexualized, right?
Mhm.
So the point becomes, so why not sexualize yourself and make money off of it, right? And again, that's a complicated claim, right? It's one that I often bring up to my class when we're talking about male rappers and female rappers playing into the stereotype. And one of the curious things that I get from the students is they say exactly what I articulate. Well, you're going to be viewed as that anyway, so why not become a millionaire, right?
Yeah.
We live in a patriarchal society anyway. We live in a sexist society anyway. We
Mhm.
live in a racist society anyway, right? Yeah, you might be the better individual if you don't sort of meet those stereotypes or you sort of buttress those stereotypes, but that doesn't mean those stereotypes go away, right? You just find yourself on the end where you're not making money, where you're not making as much money as one could make. So 50 Cent ended up being a billionaire, right? A bunch of other rap artists ended up making a lot of money off of sort of trying to fit this stereotype, right? So it's for some, right, who might find themselves in dire straits or harsh conditions, they might say, wait a minute, it might be easier to talk about selling drugs than
Hmm.
to actually sell drugs, right? It actually might be more advantageous. It might be more advantageous to talk about beating someone up or brandishing a weapon than actually owning a weapon and using it, right? So, like in this particular case, the performativity might reap greater benefits than the actual expression of this thing that is supposedly dangerous, right? And this is why you have some middle class individuals who haven't grown up in dire straits articulating some of these same sort of hardcore themes.
Right. Yeah. And I think I mean, it's almost sad to me that it feels like there are those two options, right? Like you could
Yes.
either brandish the weapon or you could talk
Right.
about brandishing the weapon, but you really don't have a choice. It's either way, you have a weapon somewhere.
Well, in one situation, you're not using it though, right? And you may not even have it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like I'm just making it up, but I'm making it up, and then all of a sudden I'm making $1 million,
right. Yeah.
right? Yes, it is. It is sad that is an option. But for some individuals, like I remember expressing this, and I express this to my class all the time, like only 34% of the population has a college degree.
Hmm.
Only 34% of the population has a college degree, right? And we know that a college degree can offer you many options. But if
Yeah.
you only have 34% of the population that has that credential, then 64, 65, 66% of the population, they have to make their way in some other form,
Right.
right? And so this is the sadness of that reality, right? Like there's a limitation of the paths that I have if I don't have a college degree. Whereas if I'm in entertainment, and that's what rap is, it's a movie, right? A movie on wax, a movie on CD.
Hmm.
But if I use this outlet to say stuff that I'm doing or not doing, I could potentially make money. And it might not be $1 million, but it might be significantly more than having a blue collar job where I'm making minimum wage, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we have to look at that, look at the themes that are being articulated within the broader society that we live in,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And this notion of violence in the music, you look at any movie that came out this past weekend, and you'll see violence,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite movies is called The Matrix.
Hmm.
But The Matrix is super violent.
Right.
There's this, I don't know if you're familiar with it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
there's this one scene in the first Matrix where like one of the main characters, Neo, is shooting this weapon, and all of the bullets are like hitting the ground. And it's so chic and it's so hip, but it's this sort of glorification of violence,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so you have that thing, and even with the previously our old cowboy movies,
Hmm.
right? You had cowboys and American Indians, right? You had the cowboys shooting and kill, right? Like violence is a part of who we are as a nation, right? And so to see that seep into other places, music, movies, television shows, it shouldn't come as a surprise, right? So
Yeah.
that's sort of the bigger cultural element
Mhm.
informing the genre as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point that it's not just sort of isolated within this genre. You sort of see it across the board and it should be
across
surprising.
across the scale. And we see patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, violence against women in movies as well,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And it's not necessarily romanticized, but we do see it happening,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So like to disconnect what's happening in this particular musical genre from everything else that's happening in our society, I think would be an error, right? It's simply a replication of what's happening in our broader world, right? Our
Right.
nation was built on violence,
Hmm.
right? I mean, the land that was taken from the indigenous folk here,
Hmm.
right? the individuals who were brought over involuntarily, right? The Africans who were brought over involuntarily, even those who've immigrated here, the violence that they experience, right? Like the United States is a violent place, right?
Mhm.
Has been a violent place, right? And so the music, I think, reflects that, but it may reflect it for through the lens of a particular population or a particular demographic.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's really good point that it's not just sort of like this individual's experience, but sort of these broader social trends.
That's right. So like there's a through line there, right? Like me talking about the Matrix and the violence that's expressed in the Matrix is very similar to the violence that's expressed in some rap music. But I should say not all artists express violence,
Yes,
right?
right, of course.
But what's interesting is like the ones who tend to express violence tend to be more successful monetarily than
Mm,
those who don't express violence.
mm. I mean, I think this is interesting too with how the rappers and the artists themselves would feel about this kind of
Right,
characterization, right?
right,
Of
right,
this is sort of a response to, these categories and labels that are projected onto
right,
them. And so they're just making the best of what they have. Because
right.
I feel like I'm not sure if the rapper themselves would feel that or think that consciously.
That's
Maybe
right.
for them, it's a sort of, no, this is really empowering and I'm doing this because I genuinely feel this way, or this.
And there could be instances
Right.
of that, right? Like there could be literal instances of
Yeah.
individuals thinking that they're a badass, right? Like I don't want or individuals thinking that they can get as many women as they want. Like that might be a general thing that individuals believe,
Yeah.
but that's not disconnected from saying like the regular college student thinking like I'm the baddest or I can get as many significant others as possible, right? Like so that's in many ways that's human, right? Or there's an arrogance there that we see expressed in all types of populations, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's just sort of like this just reflects human reality and it has to find some way to come out through art.
Yes, that's right. And I think particular artists say particular things at particular moments and particular times, and then are informed by consumers, are informed by their friends, are informed by their record label, right? So the
Mhm.
record label might say, "Hey, we think if you say this, you might sell even more," right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it is really sort of crucial to sit down with the artist and ask them, do you really believe this, right? And there have been multiple instances where artists have said, no, I don't believe that, right? But like, I can make money, right? Like,
Mhm.
right? Again, going back to my example, I should have said yes and robbed the kid, right? Like,
Yeah.
right?
I'm glad we don't have time machines. I'm very
Yes, I might not be with you here now if that were the case.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this too with women and female rappers
Yeah,
and them and sort of this idea that you were talking about earlier with them being overly sexualized and sort
yeah,
of playing on that with their
yeah,
music.
yeah.
I think that for, a female rapper, maybe she would find that problematic to say that like, okay, this is just a response to you being sexualized by society. Maybe for her it's a sort of, no, this is really empowering for me
I
and I'm
think that's right.
exploring my own sexuality.
I think that's right. So like there have been artists such as Megan Thee Stallion, Cardi B. I don't know if you're familiar with these artists, but they're Sexy Red. But they're all of these artists say this is empowering,
Yeah,
right? Like me presenting myself in this that song WAP, that this is empowering, right? Me presenting my sexuality on my own terms is empowering, right? Even though there might be the male gaze, it's still me expressing what I feel. I think that's absolutely right. And I do think we see examples of female artists actually articulating what you just said.
yeah. And then you talked earlier about examples of artists kind of bucking the trend, I think is the
Yeah,
word that you used. Of
yeah,
sort of like, this is the vein that everyone's going, this
yeah,
is the
yeah.
sort of rap persona that everyone's trying to create, but I'm
Right,
gonna go in the other
right.
direction. Are there factors that you've kind of looked in with that? Or like how does that sort of happen? How do you decide, okay, this is what the identity is and I'm gonna break from that?
Yeah, I think that's a part of rebellion as well, right? So like I think there are artists who want to subvert the sort of the paradigm, right? So if the paradigm is hypermasculinity, hypersexuality, you find some artists who say, no, I want to I want to go in a different direction, right? and I want to go in a different direction because so I wrote a book called Race, Class, Gender, and Social Consciousness, right?
Mhm.
And so the social consciousness element is sort of the part that I'm talking about now, right? So there are some artists who say, like, I'm using this genre to sort of elevate conversation
Mhm.
around things like masculinity or gender, right? Like, and
Yeah.
so they specifically view themselves not wanting to placate or not wanting to fit the stereotype, but rather to, again, as you said, to buck it, right? And they feel like that's what empowers them, right? And I think some of them understand I won't be able to make a lot of money off of this because that's not the thing that sells, but like there might be a group of for whom this particular message resonates. There might be some consumers for which this particular message resonates. And this is my authentic self as well, right? And so we see artists who've done that, and we see artists who continue to do that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's hopeful as well,
Mhm.
just in the sense of it's not always a sort of, or even, because I think that predominantly during our conversation we were talking about the sort of like external influence that plays
Yeah,
into this music and the
right,
version of yourself that you feel that you can express and
right,
explore through this medium.
right.
Um, but there can be a sort of, on the other hand, just an authentic, I think that this can resonate with the specific audience and I'm
That's right.
doing it for that purpose.
That's right. That's right. Right. So but I want to say there can be authenticity in both those realms. That is to
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
again, like there could be a person who is their authentic self saying, yes, I am a person who engages in a lot of sexual relations, right? Like, and that could be an expression of their actual reality.
Mhm.
There could be a person who says, I have a lot of money, and they actually do have a lot of money, right? So whether it plays into the stereotype or not, right? Like, so I think authenticity can be expressed in many different ways. I was teaching, so I teach a course called the Sociology of Hip Hop, and I had this one student say this really sort of this insightful thing, right? So his point was, as long as there's variation of the expression of human experience,
Mhm.
then that's okay, right? We might have negative expressions or negativity that's presented through various mediums, television, music, etc. But as long as we have other sorts of expressions that don't necessarily perpetuate stereotypes, where individuals are, sitting at home and not engaging in these sorts of activities, then that's positive. And I thought that that was really insightful, right? Because that's the expression of the human experience.
Yeah.
For example, within each person, there are moments where I am in fact angry. And there are moments where I am in fact calm and, clear-headed, right? So
Yeah.
the expression of the human experience across these genres, I think, is absolutely great, right? If and when that can happen, then that just shows the humanity in all of us. It's only when we are focusing on sort of the one particular aspect
Mhm.
that I think we dehumanize individuals, or individuals can be dehumanized.
Yeah. I think that's a really beautiful way to articulate that nuance.
Yeah,
There are these multiple elements of our identities that do shape us.
that's
We can't help that. That's just our nature.
that's right.
But it's really problematic when you focus on one of those elements as
That's
a
right. Or it's only that one element that seems to persist or
yeah,
to
yeah,
predominate, right?
yeah.
Because then you're not looking at the rest of the complexity of human beings, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And I think that kind of ties everything kind of together to even back when we were talking at the beginning of, you like race isn't this sort of fixed idea,
right,
right? You
right,
identify differently with different groups, and these
right.
different groups shape your identity in different ways.
That's right.
So you're a different kind of person in relation to these different groups that you're
That's right.
affiliated with,
That's
um,
right.
these
That's
different
right.
social forces that have affected your position right now.
That's right. That's right. And again, that's not that even though I was talking about multiracial identity, that applies to every human,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Hmm.
So, like whether we're talking about their class background, their ethnicity, their gender, their expression of masculinity or feminine, right? Like we're all informed, but also informing
Yeah.
people's identities. We impact one another, right? And that's ultimately one of the arguments that is conveyed in sociology, right? Its major premise is that we are influenced by external forces in our lives, whether that be family, education, church, etc. But we also influence those things or impact those things. So it's a two-way relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about that you think is really like relevant to this theme, any other interesting ideas that you've come across in your research, concept of the self?
No, I think I articulated all of it. Like our self is
Yeah.
informed by others in our society,
Yeah.
but we also have sort of these authentic aspects that we bring to ourselves, right? And so like I'm not a chemist, but it is a mix, right?
Yeah.
It is a gumbo that we have to sort of understand and recognize, right? That all of these identities are intersecting with one another, but they're also interacting, right? Like, so from a chemist perspective, right? They're also interacting with the environments in which they exist,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
those environments change. So, for example, I tell my students the way you behave in front of me in class is probably different than the way you behave on a Saturday night at a party, right? So context matters, right?
Yeah.
Context matters, right?
Yeah.
And all of those aspects inform our identities. And our identities are fluid and they change over time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful way to kind of wrap up this
Sure,
discussion. Yeah.
sure.
Thank you so much for being willing to join, making the
Thank you.
time. This is a lovely discussion. Uh,
Yes, I
yeah.
appreciated having it.